Well, David Suzuki, welcome to the public.
Well, thanks. Glad to be here.
Now, we're doing this series looking at the role that the CBC plays in Canadian society. Now, you've been involved with the CBC for over 40 years now. Before I get to how you started at the CBC, I want to go back a bit further and ask you about when you first recognized the importance or came to the conclusion of the importance of communicating science to the general public and wanted to get more involved in doing that.
Well, I was in the United States all during the post-Sputnik era. I was in my last year in college at Amherst College in 1957 when Sputnik went off. And that was an amazing thing. It was an electrifying experience, actually. I had no idea there was a space program. And to hear that beep of the satellite going around every day was quite moving and yet terrifying, because at that time the Soviet Union seemed so very powerful. They were making huge inroads into Africa and South America, and they seemed like this juggernaut that was rolling over the world. And at the same time, their technological advance was quite striking, because the Americans tried to launch their own satellites, and every one of them blew up on the launch pad or shortly after taking off.
Right.
Meanwhile, the Russians launched the first animal in space, a dog-like, the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, the first team of cosmonauts, the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova. And America, I often tell Americans this, that America didn't just roll over and say, oh my God, they're too far ahead, there's no way we can afford to catch up. They just said, this is the time we've got to really catch up to the Russians, and began to pour money into science, into setting up the NSF and NIH, supporting science faculties in university. And for me, as a foreigner in the States, it was glorious. You just had to say, well, I like science, and they threw money at you. When I graduated with my degree, without even soliciting jobs, I was offered a job at Stanford, at the University of California, Davis, and San Diego State University. This is just because I happen to know people that said, hey, this guy's got his PhD, hire him. It was a glorious time, but I decided that I didn't want to live in the United States. And because to me, Canada was different from the United States. I was very interested in civil rights. And although when I say we, Japanese Canadians had been imprisoned under the War Measures Act, nevertheless, Canada was my home, and I felt smaller. I didn't have to confront the segregation of blacks in Canada.
Right, and you were in Tennessee, where things were quite still...
I did a postdoc at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and that's where I really encountered the kind of racism that was built through American society, and I didn't want that. But as well, Canada was a country that had Tommy Douglas and the NDP and Medicare. To Americans, this was communism. The kind of extremism of the United States was repulsive to me. We had in Canada Quebec, which was to me very important as a distinct country. And we had the National Film Board and the CBC. These were things that all distinguished our societies, and I preferred to come back to Canada. I come back to Canada at the first job I got, which was the University of Alberta in the genetics department. And I was shocked at the level of support for science in Canada. At that time, the people I graduated with at the University of Chicago were getting grants anywhere from $60,000 to $100,000 a year, and they gave me $4,200 and said, oh, we gave you, normally the starting grant is $3,500, but you had a year of postdoc, so we're going to give you $4,200. And at that point, I thought, I've got to weigh my scientific career against the reasons why I returned to Canada. And I began to look at possible jobs in the United States. And to my amazement, I got a huge grant from the United States Atomic Energy Commission, because I'd worked at Oak Ridge, that they allowed me to keep in Canada.
Really?
So American support allowed me to stay in my own country, because if I wanted to be competitive as a scientist. But then it was at that time, this is 61, 62, that I realized that if we're going to get support for science funding, if Canadians believe that science is important, then they have to understand the role of science in society. And it happened that the University of Alberta had a television series, a community channel called Your University Speaks. And it was just basically any teacher that was a good speaker, I guess, that was allowed to talk for half an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And they asked me to do one, and they loved it, and I ended up doing 8. So in a way, that was my first television series. Now, this is on a community channel on Sunday morning. I think it was 8:30. I never saw any of them because I didn't have a TV set. But when I left for the States to go to college, it was 1954. I was from London, Ontario. There was no television station in London in 1954. So I had never watched television. It wasn't a part of my life. When I went away to college, we were too busy studying to watch TV. So I did these shows, and after about the 3rd or 4th show, I went to campus, and a guy said, "Hey, I watched your show the other day. It was great." And my reaction was, "What? You're watching television at 8:30 in the morning? Like, what is going on?" And then as more and more people started to tell me they watched the shows, I realized, my God, people watch a lot of TV, and this is a powerful way of educating people about various issues. And
so did it almost happen after you got on the television?
This is after I did the 8 series, the 8 shows.
And that's when you started to sort of realize the importance of the medium?
Remember, I didn't even have a television set at that time.
Right.
So it was not, and I was really working in the lab day and night, so the idea of watching television was not a part of the way I lived. And it was only the response to the shows I did that made me realize, my God, people watch a lot of television. I mean, I just didn't think people should be watching TV at 8:30 in the morning.
But had you already come to the philosophy that we need to communicate these scientific ideas to the public?
I can't remember back, whether I put those two together, but it was a gradual evolution. Television is a way of educating people. God damn it! Science is not being supported well in Canada. Canadians better learn a lot about it. It just kind of was floating around, and it wasn't. I don't remember a eureka moment when I said, "Oh, we need more funding, better understanding. I better use CBC TV." It never came about that way. I left Alberta after 1 year, and but I'd already had my grant. But that winter, it was 40 below for a week, and I just went, I don't think people should live in this kind of climate. And a job came up at UBC, and I was offered it, and I took it. So I transferred to the University of British Columbia. Now, at that point, I had no aspirations for doing more television, but people, I guess, heard that I had done these shows. Anyway, I started to get calls from CBC saying, "Hey, a book came out on science. Would you come on the show and review the book?" And so gradually I was doing bits and pieces, mainly on radio, and this idea evolved in my head. We should do a science show, a regular science show, which I did do in the late 60s, and that was called Suzuki on Science.
There was an interesting moment in, I think it was in the movie, the NFB movie, about your life called Force of Nature, where you mentioned an anecdote where one of your students, I think it was at UBC, invite you to give a talk at their dorm. And before this, you were sort of, science can just be, you can sort of be on the sidelines, right? You don't have to get involved with an issue. But it seemed like this changed you and sort of gave you the idea that you couldn't just sit on the sidelines.
Well, that was a very definitive moment for me. But when I got to UBC, I also began to think a great deal about the implications of genetics, because a lot of my students in my first classes were pre-meds. And as pre-meds, they were asking me about genetic engineering and cloning, And, you know, I'd never really thought much. I mean, I was a PhD in genetics, but I was interested in basic science. I'd never really thought about genetic engineering, so I began to read in the background to answer my students' questions. And as I began to read, I was horrified to discover that it was genetics that had been used to justify the Nazi race purification program in Germany. And then as I read more, I realized that very early on in the 20th century, there was the development of an area called eugenics, which was the application of genetics ideas to the breeding of people. And there was negative eugenics, which is sterilize people who shouldn't be reproducing, and positive eugenics, we should be encouraging people of the highest kind to have more babies. And guess who were considered the ones that should be negatively treated? They were blacks, they were criminals, they were the poor, and the people that were encouraged through positive eugenics were white, upper middle class people. And it was clear to me then that there was a great deal of racism inherent in the development of ideas in eugenics. And then I saw that there were eugenics acts in Canada that enabled people to sterilize people in mental institutions on a genetic basis. There were immigration restrictions in the United States that prohibited immigration from countries deemed to be inferior. And there were certain states had miscegenation acts, anti-miscegenation. There were acts against interracial marriage. So, and a lot of this was impelled by the notion that there were certain traits in humans that were genetically controlled and that could be, eliminated from society. So I began to speak out, to B'nai B'rith groups and various groups about the implications of genetics.
It reminds me of the book title by the late Howard Zinn, where it's called "You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train." That by not doing anything, you're in a sense just for the status quo.
Yeah. Well, the problem for me was that this aspect of genetics, the actual use of genetics in Nazi Germany, in the United States, in Canada, in the early 1900s, was a misapplication of genetics, but it wasn't part of our education. We weren't taught about this aspect. All we learned about was genetics was this magnificent area where people marched on the shoulders of giants and we progressed and advanced. But the negative part, you see, after the death camps in Germany were revealed and the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed, even though there was no new genetic breakthrough, the whole spirit of genetics changed. Suddenly, it wasn't that genetics was going to be able to improve human beings by breeding out the bad genes. Genetics by 1946 was, we said, no, these human intelligence and behavior are not genetically controlled, they're environmental.
So when you discovered this as you were doing research into genetics, is that sort of what further propelled you on to get more engaged?
I was being engaged because of the implications of genetics in society and having the history of the misapplication. I felt this was very important. It pissed off a lot of my fellow geneticists, who most of them didn't know about this, but didn't think that it was appropriate for a geneticist to be talking about the dark side of our activity. Because, in a sense, geneticists are like any other vested interest group. We want our area to be presented as this noble, wonderful enterprise so that people will look up to us and support us. So it wasn't a popular thing, but it was something that I felt very strongly had to be done. And gradually it evolved into the notion that science by far is the most powerful force that was shaping our lives. When I was a kid in the 1930s, early 40s, my parents wouldn't allow me to go to public swimming pools in the summer or to movies in the summer because they were afraid I would catch polio. Most kids today have no idea what polio is. My parents never worried that I was watching too much television or doing too much text messaging or playing video games because there were no such things when I was a kid. There were no jets, there were no birth control pills, there were no plastics, antibiotics, there were no satellites or cell phones. I mean, all of this stuff and much more became a part of our lives long after World War II. So here were these very powerful technologies and ideas coming into our lives, and yet if you look at our media, they're focused primarily on politics, on business, on sports and celebrity. And I felt very strongly that people had in my own self-interest as a scientist, I felt people need to know that science is important so that their granting will increase. But as well, science was hugely impacting our lives. And if we're going to have any possibility of controlling those impacts, we better be scientifically literate.
And talk about the importance of the CBC then for, I mean, through the years over various shows, it's given you a venue to be able to help talk about these issues that affect our lives in a myriad of ways, but we might not recognize it otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. My first programs were not on the CBC, but as I became more involved in, as I said, when I moved to Vancouver, it was the CBC that was calling me. Now, at that time, I didn't appreciate the role of CBC. We had very, very few alternate channels anyway in radio or television. Back then, it was CTV and CBC. There was no Global. That came on later. I mean, basically, it was CBC, and if you were lucky enough to have a big antenna and capture a signal from a nearby American city, you'd have ABC, CBS, and NBC. But in the more remote areas of Canada, it was the CBC that was the electronic link holding Canadians together. And like the railroad, I always felt that the CBC was that connector that held us together. And certainly when you saw Peter Zosky and the morning show, I mean, it was through Zosky in the morning show that really gave Canadians a sense of who we are and allowed us to see all of the foibles and the differences and the wonderful aspects that make this country distinct and special. I really think that, radio especially has been that link. For me, what CBC TV did was it gave me an opportunity, a platform to present my ideas over 35 years now and become a part of Canadian culture. What surprised me was that, and it's stupid when I think about it now, but I thought I was just a transmitter of information. You know, I thought I was like the newsreader, just reading the news night after night, providing people with information that they would then go on to use. But of course, people don't sit down and say, oh boy, the nature of things is coming on, click it on, and then sit there intently for an hour, then turn it off and go, wow, what do you think? You know, should we write somebody? Should we do stuff? That's not the way people watch TV. They turn it on, and it's on as kind of background, and then, the nature of things come on. You may watch it, but the kids, need to be put to bed, or the dog needs to be put out. You go for a beer, you go to the bathroom. You don't watch intently, and over time, the one constant turns out to be me. And so I get credit for all of these ideas, for all of the knowledge, for all the information. They say, oh, yeah, well, Suzuki did this. I didn't do that. I was just a presenter. I'm just providing a guide through that information in the same way that a newsreader, the newsreader isn't responsible for all the investigation. He's just providing the avenue or the link holding the newscast together. But I was shocked to see that I became the nature of things was who I became, and got credit for all of that. And people write to me and ask me all kinds of crazy ideas or questions now, and I write back and say, gee, I don't know. But you could go here and find the information, or you could call this guy. And they go, what? Well, what do you mean? You're a scientist. You're on TV. You got to know all that stuff. But that's not the case at all.
And now, at the nature of things, the show had its 50th anniversary not too long ago, a couple years
We're on
ago.
our 53rd year.
53rd year. Now, over the years, you've taken on some controversial topics. I was reading about the James Bay and the Hideaway before that. The where it was going to be clear cut. The Hideaway off the west coast of British Columbia was, and I think was the bay called Windy.
Windy Bay was 6,000. It was backed by a 6,000 acre pristine forest that had never been touched. And at Windy Bay, the Haida decided this is where we're going to draw the line. This simply cannot go on. Windy Bay and all of their islands, which they claim is theirs, is sacred to them, and you just don't treat the forest that way.
And you covered this on the program. Or you and your team covered this on the program, and
absolutely,
this actually had an effect on the outcome.
The program got the biggest response in the history of the nature of things up to that time, and that was in the early 1980s. A huge response to the program that the Haida feel it was very important in helping them on their fight. I think something like 70 some odd Haida got arrested. There were a lot of environmentalists who wanted to go in and get arrested along with the Haida, but the Haida said, look, this is our issue, this is our battle, we're happy to have you joining us, but we're controlling it. And they kept it very heavily controlled. The only non-Haida who was arrested was a parliamentarian, Sven Robinson, who had been adopted by the Haida, and he stood the line and got arrested along with them. But the Haida controlled the whole thing, but the Nature of Things show was very, very powerful as an aid to their battle. It really helped make it a national issue.
Now, I mean, can you talk about the changes in the CBC that have happened since you came aboard? I mean, you've talked about the cutbacks to the Nature of Things specifically. I mean, it's a shadow of the money and resources that the CBC once had to cover issues like this. Can you talk about how you've seen it change and what the effect of that is?
There's a constant battle with management. You know, people come in and they're very ambitious and they become vice president or president or whoever they are, and they're trying to set policy and worried about ratings and all these other things. And there was a constant battle within the CBC that we were considered too biased.
The nature of things was
the nature of things. So to me, this was an ongoing thing that really had nothing to do with the cuts. It's a constant issue within the CBC. What is the CBC? What is our mandate? What is our job? And my argument was always that the Nature of Things was considered biased because we took a very different worldview. There is a worldview that is the dominant worldview called anthropocentric, where humans are at the center of everything, and everything radiates out from that. So that when you look at nature, you have to look at nature from the standpoint of what's the value of nature to us. What the Nature of Things did was to take a biocentric view, which is that humans are part of a much larger system, which is the biosphere, and we're utterly dependent on the structure and the function and the well-being of all of nature. That is, it's all of the green things in the oceans and on land that take carbon out of the atmosphere and put oxygen back into it. Not a bad service for human beings like us, and we better be aware of that. But that, because the dominant ethos is anthropocentric, we were considered far out there as kind of radical people taking a biased point of view. And that argument and discussion goes on to the present time. But for me, the biggest shift in the CBC was when they decided to take advertising. And we, within the Nature of Things, argued over and over again that the nature of our programs was that including advertising within the show in a way countered often the message. You know, how can you do a show on forestry and then bring an ad in the middle of the show from a company involved in deforesting or logging or mining in forests? I mean, it just didn't make sense to us. If we're looking at energy how could we then have an ad for the nuclear industry? I mean, it just felt to us that this would in many ways compromise the message that we were often trying to raise.
Right, and that seems to be a central point of why something like the CBC and public broadcasting is important, because I mean, like you say, it's not profitable for a private enterprise or a private broadcaster to do something, to take on a controversial issue like that questions fundamentally how we do things. Could you talk about that? I mean, the profit motive isn't going to necessarily get us the media and the ideas that we as citizens need to
well,
hear.
Absolutely. One of the astounding things to me today is that we act as if corporations are people. We allow corporations to give money to support political candidates. Wait a minute now. Corporations aren't people. What the hell are they doing? Giving money, vast sums of money, far beyond what people can actually do unless you're very, very wealthy. And they skew what is the political agenda of people that we elect to look after us. And why would it be any different than when you have a network which is being supported by corporate money? You're darned right. That's going to influence the nature of the messages that come out. And that, of course, is a great pride of the CBC. It is a taxpayer that is paying and subsidizing the CBC. We have, it seems to me, by the very nature of that support, a mandate then to cover issues of great importance to Canadians, to people, not to corporations. To the extent that corporations impinge on our lives, those become legitimate issues to be discussed on various shows. And yet we were profoundly influenced by that. I remember a program we did called Voices in the Forest, and CIBC, the CEO of CIBC, came to CBC and said that CIBC was going to pull its funding. I don't know whether CIBC was actually advertising within the nature of things, or whether this was a threat to pull all of their funding out of the CBC. But you can believe me, that put a huge amount of pressure on us about this program, and it was considered a huge detriment. Now, it turned out that the CEO of CIBC was on the board of one of the biggest forest companies in Canada. And this was all pressure that came before the program even ran. I remember Macmillan Bloedel began a campaign within their company employees to write to the CBC and give them help before the show even ran. And to his credit, Adam Zimmerman at that time was the CEO of Noranda Forest that owned Macmillan Bloedel. And he said to his people, look, cool it now. Wait until the program runs. You can't go running off half-cocked when we don't even know what they're going to say in the program.
Radio is culture,
science,
Halifax, Montreal,
this country,
field, Toronto, too, throughout the CBC.
Broadcasting Canada.
I'm Kevin Caners, and you're listening to Broadcasting Canada, a special series where we meet the voices and personalities of the CBC who bring us together in conversation from coast to coast to coast. You can find us online at broadcastingcanada.com or on Twitter @handle Broadcast Canada. Now back to my conversation with broadcaster, environmentalist, and great Canadian, David Suzuki. Now, what would you say to people who say that the CBC or scientific research that isn't profit-driven, that's just a waste of money? Why would we bother finding something like that?
This is an argument that's been going on ever since we once had a Senate that actually did things that mattered to Canadians. And there was a senator from Quebec, Maurice Lamontagne, who was very interested in science, and he got a big science paper that came out. And that was, now I can't remember what year that was, that must have been in the 70s, that said that a science policy should be aimed at making science more mission-oriented. And that was the first really official sense that science should be in the service of society and of the economy. So mission-oriented was that science should play a greater role in leading to new discoveries that can be applied either in medicine or in in industry or whatever. And that argument has been boiling ever since. There have been very, very few major scientists in Canada standing up and supporting basic research. And I think that science is going to pay a price now, especially when you have a government that clearly does not understand the nature of science itself, and now is going to put more and more pressure. We now see that NRC scientists are going to have to be more allied with industry. We need to have a very strong base of basic research, it seems to me. And the way you do that is you support top-notch people regardless of what area they're in. And the reason I say that we need basic research, it is that the ultimate fuel for the big breakthroughs that are going to be made comes from basic research. Now, I remember in graduate school in the 1960s, slaving over papers by a woman named Barbara McClintock. She was a corn geneticist, and her work was absolutely elegant and beautiful, but it was very, very difficult genetic crosses that she was making. And it was involved a phenomenon that we only knew in corn, and it was called jumping genes. And genes would jump around, and wherever they landed, they would suppress the activity of the genes they were next to. We always said, this is just a peculiarity of corn. But we had to read the papers because they were so elegant. Well, guess what? Years and years later, we discovered jumping genes all over the place, including fruit flies. And now jumping genes are one of the most important tools we have in genetic engineering. And jumping genes are giving us very profound insights into how development and differentiation occurs in a developing organism. Barbara McClintock would never have been given a grant in today's climate because it was just too esoteric and too irrelevant to our ideas today.
And we have this direct idea of utility, of utility in this really narrow sense.
Pardon?
And now it seems we have this sense of like utility. Yeah. Well, that's just only in the narrowest of senses.
Yeah, we only want to support research that's going to have an application in some way. Well, no one knew at that time the application would be very powerful. She won a Nobel Prize after it was discovered how important that work was. But before that, her ideas were just regarded as an interesting phenomenon we're studying in corn. Now, in the same way, there were scientists studying how bacteria immunize themselves against viral infection. Yes, viruses infect bacteria as well. They're called bacteriophages or phages. And scientists were studying how bacteria become resistant to these viral infections. So esoteric, who the hell would ever be interested in supporting when viruses infect bacteria? But now what we've learned is that the mechanism is that the bacteria has proteins or enzymes called restriction enzymes that restrict the viruses that can infect them. And those restriction enzymes read very specific sequences of DNA before they make a cut on the DNA. And guess what? Restriction enzymes are one of the most important tools we have for genetic engineering today. So the idea that we can pre-select areas that we're going to support science to make breakthroughs in, I think is very, very, very short-sighted. You support top-notch people. Besides, Canada's total amount of research in all areas is maybe $3 or $4 billion, compared to the tens or hundreds of billions that countries like Germany or the United States or Japan or China are now investing in science. We're a very, very minor player. We have to support top-notch scientists because they are the ones that get invited to the small meetings of specialists. They are the ones who are our front row seat at the action. As long as we support top-notch scientists, they're going to be going to meetings, and they're going to be meeting top-notch scientists elsewhere. They become our eyes and ears to the cutting-edge research that's going on. And that's how you support, should be supporting science if you want to have good breakthroughs coming in the following years. Support top-notch scientists, whatever area they're in. give them the support they need to be globally competitive.
Now, you've also talked about the sort of corporatization of universities and how they've had to become, or they've decided to become, more reliant on sort of profit-driven research. Universities traditionally, of course, were places where you could ask big questions, like you were mentioning, that don't necessarily have a direct profit end. And at the same time, overall, with the CBC and public media and cuts to the arts, it seems we're losing these public spaces where we can ask questions and think about things differently and share new insights and perspectives. Why is that important to Canadian society, and why should citizens be concerned about that?
Now, come on, you can't be asking that question and expecting a serious answer. I mean, you answer it just by asking the question. How are we as Canadians going to deal with important issues if we don't have a medium in which we can explore what the various aspects of those issues are fully without constraints by worrying about getting sued or losing our corporate support in advertising? There's no question in my mind that the nature of things is not nearly as strong on issues that run against the corporate interests. I mean, if we do a show on drugs, you can bet that we're not going to explore the full range of issues that they raise. Same thing with forestry or with water issues or whatever. We're going to pull our punches a great deal. When we did Voices in the Forest, we actually pulled a small segment because of worry over being sued by a company in which I actually shot a stand-up where I said, why is it the government, the federal government, made this decision on an environmental issue? Well, let's go to the company that's involved in that issue. I won't mention the company. And then I pulled out their annual report, and I said, look who's on the board. And many of the board members were actually members of government. And I didn't say this is why government made that decision, but I said, there you have a very strong influence of the corporation on government, and we had to pull the section.
It leads to a narrowing of what can be.
Well, it was a great fear of either the government coming down on our head, and CBC has always hunkered down, whether it's a conservative or a liberal government. CBC is always under fire, and we just don't want to do it unnecessarily.
And I mean, you've also talked about the importance of imagination there's such big problems. But in order to confront those problems, you've said, first we need to imagine a different way of doing things. And it seems like both curiosity-driven and disinterested scientific research and universities and public media, that seems to be directly connected with imagination. Would you say that's true, that we need to have these things in order to regain a sense of what's possible?
Well, of course, we have to always be at the cutting edge of human thought. That's why I thought universities existed. And I think that the universities have really compromised themselves an enormous amount by being so dependent now on private money. I think that's been a terrible incursion. That's why governments should be supporting research scientists in universities to give them the freedom. And it's definitely changed the nature of discussion. If you look at a company like Monsanto, for example, when Monsanto pushes its products, and you get a few scientists who dare to take on the question of how safe these products are, and then actually publish papers that show that there are problems, the full weight not only of Monsanto, but of university professors who have vested interests in continuing with genetic engineering and the kind of manipulations going on is shocking to me, absolutely shocking. The response should be, oh my God, what if this work really is indicative of something wrong? We better find out and do more research. Instead, what you get is Monsanto trying to shut these guys down, carrying on campaigns of character assassination, and supported by top-notch geneticists saying that this is lousy science.
And of course, they have a lot more resources to do the battle than your average.
Well, of course they do, but I mean, they're being aided by research scientists in universities who should be the ones that look at this in an objective way.
Now, like you mentioned, to end off, I mean, both the Liberals and the Conservatives have made cuts to these sorts of things over the years, and it's once you get power, you've talked about this, where once you're established in the power structure, you don't necessarily want to ask new questions. You don't want there to be challenging notions out there. So it seems like it's such a hard thing to earn back. It's easy to get these things cut, but very hard to get them funded again and sort of make the argument of why they're important. So given that, I mean, do you have any ideas for how concerned citizens can go about fighting for these things, who care about things like science and
they always let me say, governments govern by immediate crises. Issues come up. If there's a group that makes a lot of noise, then governments respond to that. I was really struck when the question of supporting the Dion quintuplets came up, the surviving ones of the quints came up, and the government, I think it was the government of Ontario at that time, said no, they weren't going to support the remaining twins. And there was a huge brouhaha, and within weeks, the government changed its position. The same thing in Alberta. Alberta was the last province to stop sterilizing people under eugenics acts, and there were people coming out claiming that they had been sterilized wrongly under this act, and the government said, no, we're not going to do anything. And then a huge storm flew up, and again, in weeks, government responded to that. So, I think that there has to be some kind of recognition of the role of CBC. Maybe it's time for us as a society to really think hard about the way that communication is done in this country, and the role of CBC in that. That would be a great issue. I think it's time, in view of the revolution in communications that's going on now. We ought to be thinking about that and whether there really is a role for public support of a broadcaster. I happen to think it's absolutely critical. There is a group called Friends of Public Broadcasting, and my hat's off to them. They have taken on a lot of issues when cuts have come down, but they really are not, I think, big and strong enough to make governments consider that. Years ago, when cuts were coming, I think it was under the Mulroney government, cuts are coming to the CBC. I went to Pierre Junot, so you can tell, I don't know when Junot was in, but I met him at an event, a CBC event, and I said, with all due respect, Canadians don't know who you are. They do know who Barbara Fromm and Peter Zosky and Bruno Gerussi and these various stars are of CBC. I think that CBC, in its own interest, should send these stars, these people that are known, to the various stations across the country. You should have a program of people going out and meeting in St. John's, Newfoundland, or Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and spending a day in the community talking on the CBC television and radio, and meeting with people and talking about the role of the Canadian broadcaster. And I said, over a long period of time, you build up a strong support for the CBC. And he said, no, we can't do that. And I'm sure he was right. He said that would be seen as too much posturing by the CBC to put political pressure on. But I mean, I think that the CBC and the Canadian taxpayer has created people that are known for their roles, and I think they should be out there talking about their role in Canadian society.
Well, just to end off, I mean, you decided to stay in Canada. You had opportunities elsewhere. What about the CBC? I mean, just having, or the idea of the CBC of having one central forum where Canadians can share the same conversations instead of being fragmented into our own small worlds of reinforcing opinions, or like things have become with the internet and satellite television?
Again, your question just answers itself, it seems to me. We just, without the CBC, I just can't imagine how we could retain a sense of who we are as a people, as a society, and the kinds of values that we have. We don't have any kind of fora for having this kind of discussion anymore, and I think it's very, very sad. We need a CBC that has secure funding and does not have to use advertising. We need that in order to carry out those kinds of discussions. Right now, because of the need for commercial revenue, we are very, very sensitive to ratings. And there are a lot of issues that are of absolute importance to Canadians that simply will not get ratings. But we need those shows out there.
Well, I know I myself have enjoyed seeing your work on the CBC over the years, and listening back to some of the first episode of Quirks the other night. So thanks so much for doing what you do and bringing science to Canadians and these ideas. And
it's been a privilege, and it's been an honor for me. It's not me that you should be thanking. It's the Canadian public. And thanks to the Canadians, we still have a corporation, and we still have broadcasting that I think stands heads and shoulders above the rest of broadcasting that we get.
Well, David Suzuki, thanks so much for joining me.
Okay, my pleasure.
Well, that was my conversation with environmentalist, great Canadian, and host of CBC's The Nature of Things, David Suzuki. Well, to finish off the hour, I thought we'd play an interview that David Suzuki did on Morningside back in 1980. As I mentioned in the introduction to my interview with David Suzuki, he's long been passionate about explaining the importance and implications of science to the general public. And as you're about to hear, that's certainly a passion and a drive that comes through in this segment as well. From 1980, this is David Suzuki speaking on CBC Radio's Morningside.
And now a special welcome to someone we hope will be a fairly regular occasional guest on Morningside. I know he's a busy fellow. David Suzuki, the host of CBC TV's The Nature of Things. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Don.
Last week you were speaking in Vancouver about the teaching of science in schools in Canada. And I gather from the press reports of the speech you don't think much of how it's done.
That's true. I knocked the science or the educators pretty hard. I said that they're really failing to train or teach students to confront the greatest force that is going to affect these children's lives when they become adults. You know, if we came down onto this planet from Mars and looked at the newspapers and watched the national news every night at 11 and tried to judge what were the most important issues facing Canadians today.
The Constitution.
The Constitution. We'd say the price of a barrel of oil next year, the cost of an ounce of gold, whether or not Quebec's going to separate, unemployment, inflation.
Now, doesn't the price of a barrel of oil imply science?
Maybe, perhaps. There's a lot of politics involved. But what I like to say is, look, consider what the world was like when you and I were kids. When you and I were kids, it was dangerous to go to movies in the summer because we'd catch polio.
When you were a kid, I was already grown up. Polio, I remember the epidemic about 1936 when I had to stay home from school for almost a month and a half.
There was one in the 50s in the Maritimes that crippled hundreds of people. And yet children today have no idea, you know. Hundreds of thousands of people used to die or were scarred permanently.
You mean they don't know who Jonas Salk is? Or?
Exactly. I mean, they take it for granted. You take your pill and that's it. But I'm trying to say that the world has changed enormously, right? They didn't worry about how much television you or I watched because there was no CBC television. There was no television. There were no satellites, computers, Xerox machines, oral contraceptives, nuclear power. All of these things have happened during our lifetime. And the world has been changed far more profoundly by those things than any of the politicians or political issues that have come up.
And has the world been changed more profoundly in the last, say, 50 years than it has in the following previous 1,500?
Oh, obviously.
But people are not aware of this,
everything's being scaled down, you know. Huh?
People are not aware of this.
It's funny, you know, I've gone out in the street. We do these streeters where you stand in front of a radio store with where people come out with the latest laser discs or transistorized gizmos, and you go up to them and say, do you think science affects you in your daily life? And the overwhelming majority of people will say, no, not really. And half of them will say, I was never any good at math anyway. And I accuse the teachers of fostering this attitude. You know, Mary, because girls usually are geared or funneled away from science, Mary is told, look, you're not that good in math, so why don't you go into English or history or something like that? And from that point on, it's as if for that child, science is no longer relevant to that child's life. And the end result is the girl graduates from high school, goes to university, the chances are overwhelming they'll take a birth control pill and have no idea what that pill is doing to their body. They'll have to go out, men and women, and decide what should we do with a CANDU nuclear reactor? Or what are PCBs and are they dangerous? They're going to have to handle these issues, and they simply don't know what to do with it.
Now, are you blaming the vocational guidance department of our schools or the science teachers themselves?
I'm blaming the whole educational system, which is geared towards getting a small number of kids out to the university to go on in science. That's 5% at the most of all the students that start in grade school. And the whole system is geared towards, well, teaching Johnny math so that next year they can take chemistry and next year biology and so on, until you get to a very small number of kids in high school that are taking these highly specialized courses in science.
So the trouble starts in the elementary grades?
I think so. They're funneled at a very early age. And you can tell their inclinations and then kind of gear them along different streams.
Now, my child is away on a 3-day camp. I assume it's nature, but surely that is a beginning.
Well, you see, I think you're right. When I used to take my children for walks in the woods, they knew without me saying, all right, kids, this is ecology. This is serious stuff. They knew where to go and find salamanders. They knew where you found the wood-boring beetles. They knew all of these things through experience and through lifting rocks and logs and so on. They knew all of that, and they were excited about it and would run around and look and show me. By the time they get to high school, something's gone. You know, they know, that's a stupid question. I shouldn't ask that.
Is it the option of saying I can study this instead of that? Is that the problem?
I think part of it is that when we say this is science, this is serious, and science is done by people in white lab coats, and you know, you've got to set up the experiment and say, this is what we're trying to find, this is the apparatus, this is how we did it, these are the results. And somehow they feel that's science. And asking, Mommy, why are grown-ups so big when I'm so small? Or what is a shooting star? Or, why do the hind end of worms still wriggle when I break it in half? Somehow that's thought to be either a silly question or something that's not what scientists ask. And yet those are the really exciting and profound questions.
I read it in the press a lot, but one of the problems we cannot compete with our exports is that we have no research.
Well, you're getting into a whole different area. I think that the problem in Canada is more of a psychological one. I've written to Mr. Trudeau about this a number of times over the years.
And what has he replied?
Well, my contention is, if you don't have a people that believe they can be first-rate, then no amount of money that you pour in is going to develop excellence here. And you know, the thing that's disheartening about this country is that my son a few years ago, and this is strictly anecdotal, really believed that Canadians at least were first-rate in hockey. And I've seen him, as he got older, become more and more cynical about Canadian hockey. Well, what does a Canadian child have to really look up to and say, we as Canadians are world rate in what? Unless we revel in our outstanding people and say, of course we can be first rate. Of course our scientists will compete everywhere with other scientists around the world. Of course we're not going to let our best scientists go to the United States or Britain. We're going to give them the facilities and support here. Then I think if the federal government pours millions of dollars in, and we don't have that mentality, it's of no use. We've got to believe in ourselves. Canadian science is a part of our culture, just like ballet or art.
Well, that was a clip of David Suzuki speaking on Morningside back in 1980. Well, that's all the time we have for Broadcasting Canada for today. To find out more about the series, or to hear our other exclusive interviews with CBC personalities from Gian Ghomeshi to Peter Mansbridge, visit us online at broadcastingcanada.com. And there you can find out how to get in touch with us and how to subscribe to the podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at handle Broadcast Canada, or like our page on Facebook. Broadcasting Canada was put together by myself, Kevin Caners, along with Ken Stour, Sharon Riley, Eric Betlam, Sean Rasmussen, Brian Colley, Courtney Clinton, Joseph Novak, and JP Davidson. And final word, so what is it like to be a Canadian broadcaster?
Come on, you can't be asking that question and expecting a serious answer. I mean, you answer it just by asking the question.
See you next time on Broadcasting Canada.